The voicemail came in at the 11:47 p.m., a time when the world outside was quiet, and the small apartment I called home felt like the only safe place I had left. My phone vibrated softly on the wooden table, a subtle, unassuming warning, but I didn't rush to answer it. I had grown accustomed to her calls, the way her voice could fluctuate between warmth and authority, love and judgment, all within the span of a sentence. I had learned the patterns over the years, the hidden threats tucked inside caring words, the guilt buried beneath concern. I knew this would be different, though. There was something in the way my phone had vibrated, an odd rhythm that made my stomach tighten, a premonition I couldn't ignore. For a long time, I just stared at the phone. My hand hovered over it, hesitant. There was a strange calm in the pause, a clarity that only comes when your world teeters on the edge of a revelation you're not ready to confront. I let it buzz once, twice, and then stopped entirely, letting it rest face down on the table. Somewhere deep inside, I sensed that once I played the message, there would be no going back. When I finally pressed play, her voice poured out of the speaker, familiar yet completely alien. Every inflection, every pause, sounded like it had been carefully calculated to cut as deep as possible. "You're out, not family anymore. Don't call. Don't come here, I'm done." The words didn't echo, they landed like cold, deliberate stones thrown into the center of my chest. They were heavy and final, without the cushioning of explanation or debate, without even the hint of hesitation that might have suggested regret. The click at the end of the voicemail sounded louder than her voice, a punctuation mark that left no room for misinterpretation. I sat there, staring at nothing for what felt like hours. It wasn't just the words that hurt. It was the realization that everything I had believed about us had been conditional, fragile, dependent on convenience. The years I spent being the quiet problem solver, the mediator, the one who fixed things behind the scenes, meant nothing in the end. I had shielded the family from their own mistakes, absorbed the financial missteps, calmed storms that might have destroyed relationships, and carried burdens no one else noticed. I had been essential, useful, and now in one cruel sentence all of that vanished. A strange clarity began to settle over me. Betrayal, I realized, wasn't always violent or loud. Sometimes it arrived in the quiet, sterile tones of someone declaring you disposable. Family had always been a word she wielded like a weapon, always conditional, always flexible depending on who was useful at the moment. And now, she had sharpened it and thrown it at me. For a moment, I allowed myself the simplest, rawest reaction: disbelief. How could a single voicemail erase decades of history, sacrifice, and shared life? How could someone I had trusted, someone whose love I had believed in, reduce me to a stranger with the press of a button? My throat tightened, my hands clenched, but I didn't cry. Not yet. There was something inside me, a cold, growing determination, that told me tears would serve no purpose. Not now, not here. Instead, I sat with the silence that followed the click, letting it settle in my chest like ice. I played the voicemail again, slower this time, listening to each word, dissecting it, letting the weight sink deeper. And with each replay, a quiet, almost imperceptible thought began to take root. If they thought cutting me off meant they could erase me, they had no idea how wrong they were. By the time dawn crept through the blinds, painting pale stripes across the room, I had made a decision. There would be no screaming matches, no desperate pleas for recognition. They had chosen this path. They had drawn the line. And now I would walk it with eyes wide open, knowing exactly how much power they had unknowingly handed me in their own cruelty. This was not the end. It was the beginning, the first act of a reckoning they had never imagined, orchestrated not with violence, but with precision, patience, and a cold, unyielding truth. They had underestimated me, and they would soon understand the consequences of their words. By the time the sun fully rose, the shock had burned itself out, leaving behind something sharper and far more dangerous than anger: clarity. I moved through the morning quietly, deliberately, as if any sudden motion might crack the calm I was holding together. Coffee brewed untouched. The world continued as if nothing had happened, which felt almost insulting after a single voicemail had managed to redraw the boundaries of my life. I opened my laptop and stared at the screen, fingers resting lightly on the keys. This wasn't panic. This wasn't revenge fueled by rage. This was inventory, a careful mental walk through every place my presence existed, every invisible thread I had tied and maintained over the years without applause or acknowledgement. They had always underestimated that part of me, the part that handled things quietly, efficiently, without drama. They saw me as background, support, convenient. They never bothered to learn how much weight background structures carry until they collapse. The trust was the first thing that surfaced in my mind. It had been framed as a gesture of inclusion, a symbol of unity, but the truth was more practical than sentimental. My name wasn't there because of love, it was there because of stability. I was the safe one. The responsible one. The one institutions trusted when emotions ran high and credit histories ran low. I remembered the conversations, the subtle pressure, the way it had all been presented as just paperwork, family helping family. I logged in and navigated the familiar menace with ease. No hesitation, no second guessing. When I removed my name, there was no dramatic sound, no warning bell, just a confirmation message that blinked briefly on the screen before disappearing. It felt almost anticlimactic, which somehow made it more powerful. Years of assumed access undone in seconds. Next came the account, the shared one, the one meant for household needs, though somehow those needs always expanded when I was around. I had watched money move in one direction far more often than the other, telling myself it was temporary, that things would balance out eventually. They never did. I had accepted that imbalance as part of belonging. But I didn't belong anymore. They had made that very clear. Freezing the account felt less like an attack and more like closing a door that should have been locked a long time ago. I imagined the confusion it would cause later, the sudden realization that access wasn't guaranteed. Not out of cruelty, out of consequence. Boundaries have a way of announcing themselves loudly when they're finally enforced. The house deal lingered in my thoughts longer than the rest. It wasn't just a transaction. It was a symbol of their future, something they spoke about with pride and certainty. They told friends how everything was lined up, how it was only a matter of time. What they never mentioned was the foundation beneath that certainty, my signature, my assurances, my quiet agreement to carry risk that wasn't mine to begin with. I made the call calmly, voice steady, as if I were canceling a subscription rather than dismantling an illusion. I stated my decision clearly, without explanation or apology. On the other end, there was a pause so long I wondered if the line had gone dead. It hadn't. I ended the call and sat back, letting the silence settle around me. For the first time since the voicemail, I felt something close to relief. Not joy, not satisfaction, relief. As if I had finally stepped out from under a weight I hadn't realized was crushing me. They thought cutting me off stripped me of something. In reality, it had given me permission. Permission to stop overextending. Permission to stop proving my worth through sacrifice. Permission to let the systems I had propped up stand or fall on their own. I closed the laptop and looked around the room. Nothing had changed, yet everything had. The invisible strings were gone, one by one, and in their absence, I felt strangely light. Whatever happened next was no longer my responsibility. They had drawn the line. All I had done was respect it. The next morning, my phone began to vibrate incessantly, shattering the calm of the apartment. I didn't rush to answer it. Every buzz, every flash of light on the screen was a reminder that my actions, the quiet, deliberate steps I had taken, had consequences, and the consequences were arriving in real time. By the time I glanced at the clock, it was 6:03. 5 missed calls already stacked on the screen. I ignored them, let them pile, let them fester. By 6:10, the number had doubled. By 7:23, by 9:79, each one represented a frantic, desperate attempt to reclaim control, to reach the person they had so carelessly declared not family. Voicemails layered over each other, a chorus of panic, guilt, and confusion. My mother's voice changed as the calls progressed, from sharp and commanding to hesitant, then fearful and finally pleading. It was strange listening to someone you knew so intimately unravel entirely over something they had caused themselves. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. My lawyer did eventually. When his call came through, I had made myself a cup of coffee, poured it, and sat at the window, watching the city move as if it hadn't just been thrown into chaos by one phone call, one deliberate action. "We have a problem," he said cautiously, as if testing whether I would panic. His voice was calm but carried an undercurrent of urgency that made it clear the situation was bigger than I had imagined. I laughed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a small, controlled laugh that carried the weight of years of unnoticed work finally being recognized. "No," I said, voice steady. "You have a problem." He tried to explain the complications, the legal exposure, the delays, the potential losses. I let him speak, only listening partially, because the truth of it had nothing to do with contracts or signatures. It had to do with the raw realization that the very foundation of their life had been built with threads I had maintained, threads they now ignored at their peril. "I'm not involved anymore," I said finally, cutting him off politely but firmly. They made that very clear. Silence stretched over the line, heavier than any apology I had ever wanted. I could almost hear the panic, the frantic calculations running behind their voices, though they weren't speaking to me. It was as if the world had tilted and I was standing perfectly upright while everyone else scrambled to adjust. By mid-morning, the missed calls slowed, replaced by text messages. Short, fragmented pleading attempts at reconciliation or at least explanation, offers to fix things, promises to make amends, but there was no longer a recipient for these messages in the way they intended. I had already stepped outside the system they had relied on. I had already removed myself from the invisible scaffolding they had depended on for so long. It was strangely satisfying. Not because I enjoyed seeing them flounder, but because for once, the power they had taken for granted had shifted. They had assumed loyalty and presence were infinite. They had assumed that family, as they defined it, was a guarantee. I had merely reminded them that it wasn't. I spent the day in quiet observation, checking emails, responding only to the essentials, and otherwise letting the chaos of their reactions play out without interference. I didn't need to watch closely. The patterns were clear. Accounts frozen. Deals canceled. Meetings postponed. Calls returned with confusion and regret. Every domino fell exactly as it should. And all the while the small, controlled laugh I had begun the morning with returned to me occasionally, a private acknowledgement of the shift in reality. They had claimed I wasn't family. I had let them have that claim. And now the consequence of their own words was unfolding beautifully, perfectly, and without my direct interference. By evening, when the world outside slowed and the apartment quieted, I sat back in my chair, sipping cold coffee, and let the weight of the morning settle. For the first time, I understood the real power of calm, deliberate action. Not the kind fueled by emotion or anger, but the kind that comes from knowing your worth, understanding your leverage, and letting the world respond in its own way. They had made the problem. I had simply reminded them of it, and in that reminder lay the quiet, unmistakable power of control regained, of respect earned, and of revenge so perfectly measured it didn't need to be shouted, it only needed to be felt. The days that followed were quieter, but the tension lingered like a low hum in the back of my mind. Their calls and messages slowed, no longer frantic, but calculating. I could sense the attempts at manipulation, the half-hearted apologies, the excuses dressed as reasoning. Every word they sent carried the weight of someone realizing that the support they had always assumed was theirs by default had been deliberately withdrawn, and that withdrawal had consequences far beyond what they had imagined. I never responded. Not once. I didn't need to. Their panic, their guilt, their frustration, all of it unfolded without me lifting a finger. There was no triumph in watching them scramble, only satisfaction in recognizing that the scales had finally tipped. I had stepped outside the web they had woven around me, and now the web itself was tangling them. I felt neither malice nor joy in their struggle. It was merely the natural result of choices made and paths taken. Months passed, and the chaos gradually settled into new patterns. The trust, once dependent on my name for stability, had been restructured hastily, and the house had sold for less than expected, a loss they hadn't foreseen. Accounts remained frozen until they navigated the complexities of financial institutions without my presence. Meetings once taken for granted had to be rescheduled, negotiations stalled, and promises made in casual confidence were now under scrutiny. All because they had assumed loyalty and access were permanent. I, meanwhile, moved through the world with a sense of lightness I hadn't realized I had been missing. Life felt quieter, yes, but not empty, free. For the first time, I could make decisions solely for myself, unburdened by the constant expectation of smoothing over someone else's mistakes. The freedom wasn't loud or dramatic, it was a subtle, pervasive shift, like sunlight filling a room long after the clouds have passed. I had always been capable of this life, of standing on my own, but I hadn't realized how much the weight of their entitlement had held me down. Their attempts to reach me gradually became more desperate and then, finally ceased. I wasn't curious anymore. I didn't need reconciliation to validate my choices. Their words had no power over me now. The voicemail that had initially felt like a wound had transformed into a marker, a boundary, a declaration that allowed me to rebuild my life on my own terms. I started taking small steps toward rebuilding what I wanted, not what they dictated. Decisions once filtered through the lens of their approval were now entirely mine. Investments, living arrangements, personal projects, all of it aligned with my vision, not theirs. Every achievement, no matter how small, carried a quiet satisfaction because it was earned in solitude, without the shadows of obligation or expectation. And yet, I didn't need revenge in the traditional sense. There were no confrontations, no sharp words exchanged. The true revenge was the quiet unfolding of consequences they had ignored, the realization that the life they had built with me as a foundation was suddenly more fragile. Their panic and scrambling had been temporary, but the absence of my presence, the recalibration of a world that had depended on me, was permanent. Sometimes, late at night, I replay the voicemail in my mind. Not with pain, not with longing, but as a reminder of the moment I chose myself. It is not bitterness I feel, but clarity. They said I wasn't family, and in that declaration they unknowingly granted me freedom. And freedom, I learned, is far sweeter than any confrontation or punishment. By the time the months had fully passed, I had learned a profound truth: true power does not come from anger or malice, nor from dramatic gestures. True power comes from self-respect, from removing yourself from the systems that no longer serve you, and from letting consequences unfold naturally. They had underestimated me, relied on my compliance, and believed that love, or obligation, was an unbreakable tether. I had untied it, gently, deliberately, and walked away. They had made me nothing, according to their terms. But in stepping away, I became everything entirely on my own. And in that, I found the sweetest, quietest revenge of all, a life rebuilt, untethered and free.